I've done two videos, one on what makes a Christian, and the other on what is specifically an atheist. Now, they are distinctly different for interesting reasons, because whilst Christian can be broadened into a whole swath of things, such as mindset, a way of living, a religion, a worldview, a belief, an attitude. You can name it as many different things. Atheism is neither of those things, and more importantly, quite a few people on that persuasion will say it's neither of those. It is merely a statement. And yet they will apply so many things to atheism that they claim describe atheism to a T. When realistically, that can also include other things. It can be a broader church, it's not specifically atheism. And not all of them are even atheistic. Quite a few of them are theistic. And even those that are atheistic aren't necessarily non-religious. Which is always going to be an interesting thing to consider, especially with those who are online arguing about it, arguing over what it means to be an atheist, and ultimately why some people will turn away from religion and fall into an atheist mindset. Some will say it's a default, but as I've already said in a couple of videos, that is just not the case. Because that is assuming a ground state even exists. I mean, if the whole point of atheism is that it's a lack of knowledge or lack of understanding of God, does that give them a good position on God, or knowledge in general for that matter? I don't think so. If anything, it's a bad thing to be claiming in that case. Because that implies that atheism is a lack of knowledge, not an increase of it. And just because you lack a concept of God, or gods in general for that matter, does not necessarily mean that you're atheistic. Like if someone who was born with any concept of the LGBTQIA could be considered, by definition, straight and cis. I'm pretty sure everyone will say that is not the case. Which heavily implies that knowledge does not make it a given fact. Knowledge is merely our understanding of it. And if the lack of knowledge means you're an atheist, then it's actually a poor position to be in the first place. I said this before. So, what is the big difference? As I said, atheism is a actual separation from theism. That is its whole point. Its whole raison d'etre, if you will. But I think I'm using that word wrong. So why are those two videos so different? One trying to broaden Christianity to all parts of the world, and one trying to narrow atheism down. Well, it's simply because if you try broadening the idea of atheism into other things, it loses cohesiveness, if you will. If you try applying things that you claim are purely atheist, such as a skeptical mindset, such as looking for evidence rather than blind faith, making action rather than blindly waiting for miracles, you actually come across several areas of the Christian church alone where they end up with those particular mindsets. Action instead of miracles, that is literally the Salvation Army. Faith through action, faith in action, if you will. That's also also pretty much the Templar orders, the knightly orders. They no longer exist, thank goodness. That's basically paladins. Those that study. Churches may not have been the pinnacle of knowledge in certain time periods, but you've got to remember that the religious orders were some of the very few places where people had the time and even the education to study things outside the everyday. They may have been focusing on God's work and how to best express that to people, but that is the way it developed. Some people will say that they saw no reason to add God into the equation, but realistically, that isn't necessarily the case. Some people may very well look at the world through the lens of science and decide that God has no place in it. Other people may look at it in other ways and decide that other aspects of our knowledge do not apply. There are those that will say that human interaction has no bearing on things, and therefore we should basically bring everything down to raw data. Some people say emotions don't matter, and therefore should not be a factor. In fact, interesting enough, people say personal experiences do not matter, in fact are a very poor form of evidence, which is indeed an important factor to consider. Just because there are people who are eliminating various aspects of understanding, various aspects of where we get our knowledge from, various aspects of evidence, does not eliminate them entirely as a source of evidence. If anything, you lose sight of what the evidence originally was. I often say that if you're going to use science having a repeatable method, all you're demonstrating is that people can experience that same thing again and again. Everyone can experience it. In short, you're basically calibrating a personal experience. And that, I think, is the difference. I honestly don't know what is the difference, some people might say, between indoctrination and education. There's one person that said that indoctrination is education that you don't approve of. But then again, how do you define education? If it's the ability to give people information from which they can learn, isn't that the same as essentially indoctrinating them to look at the world in a certain way? Isn't it essentially calibrating people to understand the world in a specific way, looking at things in a set manner? Given how science updates itself time and again, you could say some people might just get stuck in old ways.
One thing I missed in that section was explaining my thoughts about education, or indeed indoctrination, being more of a calibration. So if we use our minds like scientific instruments, we can view the world in a very particular way if we educate people in the right way. And education can certainly be seen in this way. Many people will say that indoctrination is making sure everyone is like that. And strangely enough, there are some people that use other forms of education training to get people to think in those ways. There was someone saying that Pat Borelli was far too focused on making every single horse the same horse, which I can sort of understand their view on that. Doesn't change my position on the Borelli method, though. Understanding or processing this is very important. Fine-tuning a student's internal metrics to align with demands and standards and reality of the outside world. It is essentially just trying to train them to understand the world as it is, which is very much true. Some people might say that if you're trying to train someone rigorously in a particular way, that you are essentially indoctrinating them. And that is where the clash happens. I decided to ask this question just to see what Google came up with. Is education just approved indoctrination? It's interesting to say that it's not, but it can have a blurred line. And I like the interesting phrase, true education, focuses on how to think, equipping your mind with critical thinking and analytical tools. So there is an interesting situation. Because rigid obedience, education is encourages to question evidence from perspectives. Is that really the case, or is it simply passing on certain bits of information so we can absorb and understand other things? I like the fact that people seem to push the idea of education encouraging questions, when many teachers will say, let's finish and get on. And often we'll be focusing on giving you the answers. And yet when we try to do the same with atheists on the forums, they seem to just be demanding that we give them the answers. Do they want to be educated or indoctrinated? Just saying this, is indoctrination a form of education? The concept originally referred to education, but after World War I, the term took a pejorative meaning akin to brainwashing or propaganda. Some distinguish indoctrination from education on the basis that an indoctrinated person is able not to question or critically examine the doctrine they have learned. There's an interesting one. What will Einstein say? As I viewed education not as the memorization of facts, but as the training of the mind to think critically. You'll be amazed how few things actually crop up in this regard. But I remember basically being given just a load of facts, and that's what we had to do when it came to our science tests, and certainly when it came to our history tests. Assume they even bothered to give us material to work with for the exam.
To get back to personal experience, or at least the old ways of thinking, we end up in an interesting situation where some things from the past are actually more effective than things in the present. An interesting one is the hygiene hypothesis. For those of you who don't know, the hygiene hypothesis is basically explaining why there's so much autoimmune disease in the developed world, but almost none of it in the developing world. My sister-in-law, for example, she has lupus. I do not know what her environment was like growing up, so I cannot prescribe the hygiene hypothesis for that. I can't backdate it like that. No. But I'm being very aware of all those autoimmune diseases ideas, and certainly allergies, whilst raising my daughter. Because the more we expose her to in reasonable amounts today, the less she will suffer from in the future. Interestingly enough, that is literally the whole idea behind vaccines. That is literally giving people a small version, either a weak, a dead, or a tiny amount of the living virus, so the body can learn to fight it. Are we to say the best way to educate people is basically to train them in how to deal with these sort of things, these sort of scenarios? I suppose it's to only give people toolkits. But isn't that basically going to the realm of apologetics as well? I think my point is being proven clear. You can ascribe many, many things to atheism, but also find a parallel, if not an exact replica, or even the source of it, in religion of some sort.
Other things like common sayings, common idioms, common in everyday language. Ricky Gervais has often been quoted to say, do to people as you like to be done to you. Treat people how you like to be treated. Which is very much a biblical thing. I think it's in Proverbs. Do unto others as you would have done to yourself. And there are plenty more like this. So, common idiom would be salt of the earth, going the extra mile, turn the other cheek, being a good Samaritan, cast the first stone, cast pearls before the swine, the writing on the wall. You get the idea. Even the skin of your teeth. I wasn't aware of that one. The goodbye. That one's even interesting because that's literally God be with you in English, and eye for an eye. Many people say that eye for an eye, cast first for the swine, and even cast the first stone, very much a Christian thing and very biblical. But you'll be amazed how many of them actually do crop up when you're paying attention to them.
They would probably say colonisation is something that's purely religious, but then again, changing the minds of people from one way of thinking to another, that happens to be the way we think, isn't that again basically educating them? I mean, my wife grew up in Nigeria, and in her village they used the same river for drawing water, for drinking, washing their clothes, and dealing with their waste. The same river at different points. Most people think that if you just simply do any of that in the same river, you're in big, big trouble. But it's clearly an old system that's worked for however long that village has been there, and clearly the settlement has thrived to the point where people can go and get educated in the big cities and eventually travel the world and even become important members of society in other parts of the world.
There are a number of examples that crop up, or at least tangentially to my question of whether a more modern approach is always the best idea. In one case, there's the British administration in what is now Malawi, where they essentially tried using modern agricultural techniques to combat soil erosion, and it worked very well in Britain. It worked very well across Europe. So they thought, why don't we move in, tell people to use this method and see how it goes. And it ultimately destroyed the farms in Malawi. So this is a prime example of how modern methods do not always guarantee a successful outcome compared to the older ways. Another is the Tanganyika groundnut scheme, which was, by the looks of it, 6 years of British attempts to cultivate large amounts of oil and nut reserves in Britain, and as a result decided, we'll go to Tanganyika, which is modern-day Tanzania, and plant a load of nuts, groundnuts, which is basically modern peanuts. This not only caused a huge problem because it didn't really work. The machinery just ended up breaking down, causing problems. The environment was not suitable for such vast amounts of nuts, and essentially the British had not planned anything in advance. They just thought, we'll throw some money at this and see what happens, and they threw all their money into it and just basically failed. What was it that they ended up spending? About 36 million, which in those days was pretty huge. I'm not entirely sure of the inflation rate, but it's not a small amount. And it just caused a huge problem because they had no backup plan. You could say it's British hubris, but it's an example of how they tried to put modern technology into a situation that they had no idea about, and it failed drastically.
Then the most prominent one is Mexico City. As far as I'm aware, the original capital of the area was purely a floating city. Reeds and wood and planks and so forth. And then that got burned down by the conquistadors. And yet when they built over the area and tried to make it solid concrete, it has suffered from sinkholes and floods galore, because it's not designed with the world in mind.
Interestingly enough, the city I was mentioning was indeed the modern Mexico City, which was based on the Aztec ruins of the city Tenochtitlan. I've definitely butchered that pronunciation. But the beautiful thing is that the original was entirely designed around the Great Lake Texcoco. And was using the waterways as methods of watering, floating gardens, and as a method of transport. Whereas the Spanish later drained it, used it for canals, and tried to build a colonial city. Today, it's basically a massive concrete slab, which, as concrete slabs do, is sinking into the lake. So from a thriving city in the era to a to an overpopulated slab that is sinking into the lake. It is a fascinating thing that back in the day they had a system that worked very well, and then the modern world turned up and messed it up.
Even my town of Peebles, the River Tweed had been straightened at one point to allow for better watercourse for shipping. But the amount of bank erosion and eventual flooding further down the river made that rather untenable. We brought all manner of misinformation into the mix to try and knock down religion and even try to knock down science for the way it is. But realistically, if you narrow down what each of them are, you can see how one can easily be broadened out into many things and still be at its core the thing that it wants to be. For example, Christianity, the attitude, how we respond to people could be by Christ's commandments, could be by the Ten Commandments. Our understanding of people, our perception of them, again, could be done through the teachings of the church and all that sort of thing. In fact, so many things that people say, as White says, even Ricky Gervais says, treat people how you want to be treated. That is very much a passage in the Bible. I can't recall where I think it's in Proverbs. Do unto others as you would have done to yourself. That is literally a biblical phrase that he has taken solely to heart. Do I pretend he's not knowing this or trying to deny it? I don't think so. I don't know. I do not recall him saying anything about it. But if I jump to conclusions on this, then I'm just as bad as anyone else trying to make assumptions about it. I've said it time and again. Atheists can easily say and do things that Christians, and certainly those who call themselves Christians in parts of the world where they act otherwise, do a lot. I've seen it time and again on the forums, people saying things that just don't, that you can either confuse for being theistic, atheistic, searching, you name it. It's harder to pin down what people think just by watching them online. And it's all a matter of taking your time and examining them.
This is an interesting example of a position where both Christians and atheists can hold the same one. Many people say the anti-abortion crowd is all religious, but in actual fact there are many secular pro-life activists. It's easy enough to look them up. Interestingly enough, though, my simple statement of I do not believe in your God, or your version of God, can easily be a Christian sentiment, because there are many people that have a position on God that doesn't line up with our own study of the scriptures. I mean, I can easily say that the straw man version that many atheists throw up is most certainly not the God I believe in. So, in a way, they might say we're atheistic to their sort of God. Does that make us an atheist? You can see where it starts to double up.
The moment you start applying anything more general to atheism than the simple statement of I do not believe in God, or I do not believe in the God you're talking about, it falls apart. And interestingly enough, I've never seen atheists really agree on how to define atheism. What it is a mindset, it's a worldview, stuff like that. No. Granted, that does not devalue it, does not make it as ridiculous as some people claim it does for religion. But it doesn't exactly give it the firmest of grounds to stand on if no one can fully agree on what it is, on what it means, on what we can gain from it. It's literally just a line in the sand. And yet so many people can cross that line in both their attitude, in their position, in how they claim things can be, even taking aspects of stuff they argue against. I know it is me basically saying the best sort of atheist is someone who just says, yeah, I'm simply saying, I don't believe that, come and move on. And I can't deny that is a good sort of atheist. Does that mean that the denouncers and anti-theists are just going way too far? Potentially. But I think they've got their own purpose. That is something I'll cover in another video soon. But for now, I just want you guys to think. If you're trying to separate yourself from something, know exactly what it is you're saying and how it applies to other things before you make that statement your call. And if you're trying to spread something into all corners of things, see that its core principle matches with what you're trying to say. Christianity, or the Christian mindset, the worldview, the belief, the attitude, can mean so many things. And that's just keeping the core principles of Christendom. The moment you start blurring things like that, that is when you start seeing how other things creep in. It doesn't become the no true Scotsman fallacy. There's no denying that. And that is why studying is important. Studying for yourself, which does indeed sound like an atheistic thing to do. But that is why, again, study is important. Learning the terms and understanding what it means to be a Christian, as well as what it means to be an atheist, which, by its very etymology, is a lack of faith in God. Or at the very least, a position that says, I don't believe in God. Keep that in mind, friends. Stay safe.